know you were very attracted to poetry in kindergarten, that you wrote your first poem when you were 5,
Yes.
that you published at 13 your
Yes.
poems in a local
Very
newspaper, that you were encouraged by your parents to read and to write. But when did you feel this kind of awareness that I am a poet?
I would say when I got to my mid-30s, about the age of 36, I felt that I had arrived, that I had really gotten my chops down.
Any particular incident?
I became a professional writer, oddly enough, when I was writing for the soaps, for Days of Our Lives.
Uh-huh.
And during the year and a half that I worked with the writers of the NBC show, I wrote the worst poetry of my life. It was terrible. And I was so dismayed because everything else I did, all the jobs that I worked at, whether I was a waitress or a bartender, they were all to support my life as a poet, basically, and myself and my children too. But as a single parent, most of my young adult years. And I couldn't believe that the poetry had gone away. And then I was laid off and then let go permanently from the writing for the soap. And I didn't mind that so much. And then one day I sat down to start writing, and I had a new discipline all of a sudden. It was as though the poems were coming on their own. I had become so disciplined as a television writer because it's very unforgiving work, and you have to be on the money. You can't afford to slack. And what it did was, it was like exercising your writing muscles. And I found that after I left when I turned to poetry, after I left Days of Our Lives, those poems literally jumped off the page. And that was an amazing experience. I used to call it zoning. It was the kind of thing, you know, the poets of previous generations had taken peyote and had gone on and drank absinthe and went on these long journeys. They worshiped the muse. If only they could get into that zone to write. And here I had it. I had what these people had destroyed their lives trying to get. I got from working as a soap opera writer. I couldn't believe it.
So at that time, you found yourself like, I am a poet.
That's right. It was there.
Is this something that has happened to you later, or it was just that moment and then you have been kind of
It was
looking
that
for
moment,
that?
and it has just grown since then.
I read something very interesting. You said, I cannot afford to have a routine or something like that.
My lifestyles have always been very difficult because I was a worker. So, and often I had 2 or 3 jobs at a time, you know, with days staggered. So I never had a day off. So I had to write around the edges. I had to find times when it was quiet. When I was a single parent, I could get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and maybe I'd have 2 or 3 hours to write. I hated to have my time wasted standing in line at the bank, at the post office, getting ready to pay for my groceries. I have that notebook out making notes for poems. If a line would come to me, you know, sometimes I pull over if I'm driving. I pull over to the curb and I write the line down, and then I go on my way. So when the poem started coming, I would try to find some way to write it. You know, and if I couldn't get to a piece of paper, I try to remember, I give myself a key to unlock the poem later. You know, I'd memorize a phrase.
I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Tony Magistrale?
Magistrale.
Magistrale. He says, Coleman frequently writes to illuminate the lives of the underclass and the disenfranchised, the invisible men and women who populate America's downtown streets after dark, the asylums and way stations, the inner city hospitals and clinics. You have a lot of literary criticism about you.
Yes.
When you hear these people, do you recognize yourself in what they say?
Usually, yes. Tony was the first, I would say the first academic to pay attention to my work. So I really appreciate his critiques. I come from the American underclass, and there's all my material right there in front of me. And I often enjoy cloaking myself in the lives of others. People, I found it, as a teenager, a very strange phenomenon. There was something about me that drew people who had stories to tell, so that I'm waiting for a bus, or I'm riding a bus, or I'm walking through a park, and someone will gravitate toward me and they'll begin to talk, and they'll present their stories to me. So I have this reservoir of material outside of what I directly experience myself. So not all of the stories I tell are mine. See?
But all of them sound truthful.
I appreciate what I'm given, so I do my best to honor it and respect it.
You're a very, very prolific author. You have written, I don't know, 20 books of poetry and short fiction. And when we Google you, because now we have to Google everybody, when we Google you, one of the first things that appears is Wanda Coleman, an LA poet. You are always associated with Los Angeles for some reason. I mean, I think it has good connotation, not so good connotation. Sometimes it's a way to kind of make somebody a little smaller than they are. But it's a fact that you appear as an LA poet. And you say that Los Angeles is an unending source of material for your writing. Which kind of changes have you seen in the Los Angeles poetry landscape since you started writing?
There are more Latino and Hispanic voices. There are more Asian and Asian American and Islanders. So the diversity, you know, similar to any port city, you're going to find that. You're going to find across all of the spectrums, from class to sexual preference. And that's exciting. That cross-fertilization enriches. And the thing I like most about Los Angeles and the poets who evolve here is that there's more freedom to explore the psyche and the self and the art form itself. You don't have the pressures to conform, the pressures to stay within a certain margin in terms of your voice that you have in other parts of the United States. Here you have more latitude. Part of that is because of the geography, and a number of anthologists have noticed that. It's very difficult to have a clique here. No one can really be cock of the walk here. You know, there's too many areas. You know, I call them ethnocosms.
Ethnocosms.
To go back to a point you made before about me being called an LA poet, you never hear anyone called a New York poet, do you? Huh? You see?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and sometimes I'm referred to as a Venice poet, which I like too, because of Beyond Baroque and my association with Beyond Baroque for so many decades. So, I don't mind the labels, but I do mind the marginalization or the diminishing. I don't mind being defined, but I do mind having to be constrained by the limitations of others.
Would you mind reading one of your poems that has Los Angeles in the title?
Okay.
It's called Los Angeles Nocturne, and it's from your book Ostinato Vamps.
Los Angeles Nocturne. Eternity ends where Hollywood begins. To be there is to scarf and strangle on those cool, thick lids and hot brown eyes, is to possess the unpossessable, fever and cure, is to ignite those cold stars over Avalon, like stumblers through long paved hearts, looking for the back entrance to love, is to set them in a dreamscape of asphalt and desire, a sea of tight ambition and loose thighs. Southerly, off Graham, street lamps wave like raffia when earth quakes. Night prowlers cruise jungle to jungle, anxious to score the light. No reservations tonight, it's a dress-down affair. Stilettos like high-pitched hopes heard stabbing down sidewalks, while behind slammed doors the Molochs tally ill-gotten dreams, and low-hung coupes take stops doing the South Central roll. The unreachable, unbreachable, unteachables, hands shoved so deep into pockets they can feel the next world. Remember the Parisian room? Remember the California club? Remember memory lane. Normandy zigs where Jefferson zags. You too can touch it as much as you want. You too can taste it as much as you want. There is everything to feel there. Throbbings in your palms like my heart. Eternity ends where Hollywood begins.
Thank you very much. There is something that you do very well, and I think is very difficult to do. Is the use of sexuality and eroticism. Is very, sometimes it's very strong, it's very descriptive, but it's always necessary, and it always feels very truthful. And you do that also not only with people, but you also do it with landscapes. There is one poem that is called Meanwhile in San Francisco, where I think you have that kind of traveling from the eroticism of the person to the eroticism of the city. I would like you to read that poem too, but do you have any comments about that in your work?
Well, that comes from being an editor of men's magazines, which I did in my young adulthood for about, maybe an 8-year period. And often I had to write pretend to be a man and write from a male point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So that was quite an education. It was an interesting world to enter. I edited about 9 men's magazines. And I laughed from 9 to 5 because it was my coworkers and I, we joked all the time, and it was a hilarious circumstance. So that became a part of who I was, in a sense. The human equation, the sadness. There was a great deal of sadness in that world. And that was impressive, that sadness especially. Also, there was another aspect to that. Painters do that. If you look at some of the landscapes that painters paint, you see women in the landscape. You see the object of their love in the landscape. And musicians do that. Often a musician plays the instrument as though the instrument is their lover. Drummers especially.
Mm-hmm.
And so from watching these other artists, that I began to absorb that information, where the points were, where the eroticism was. And I began to make that manifest in my poetry and in my prose. Lone cold brings on chilblains. It's in the deep 60s, and this is the city of free love and paisley. Hug a drug and eat a bug culture. A sexual revolution going on as panthers and peacocks mate to produce a movement. Against dim desire, he watches. I undress quickly beneath the Dutch ceiling, slit out of pink panties. He's already naked with a nice hang as thick as my fist, between powerful chunky legs, which makes up for his being 2 heads shorter, his mouth barely at my nipples. Where are you from, he asks. South Hell. Are you married? No, but involved. We are young, we are ebony. In the garden, we rake the leaves. He grows sad. I've never been married. Women don't like short, dark men. The climb into his bed is a plunge into ice water. I shiver. He hurries, places his body so we fit. Stay. Please stay, lady, whoever you be. I fail to explain. No, I'll be gone come sunrise. I'm in love with a place, not a man.
Such a beautiful line. This is a great line. You say this, you say, you are bicultural, and if you are smart enough, you are bilingual, because there is definitely a difference between writing with a black sensibility and what I call writing white. And then, after the quote, you say, I no longer fully agree with this fast talk, which is an oversimplification of an extremely complex dynamic, and then you keep continuing with that. But I relate to this because of my, bilingualism or whatever, being part of one world and to the other one, and both are active at the same time. So what's your opinion on this today?
I don't think there's a contradiction there. It was easier to say it, I think, especially when I'm speaking to young audiences, because especially young black audiences. I had to spend, when I told you I was a magazine editor, well, that was very much a part of the writing white world. I couldn't sound like an African American. But one time I picked up the telephone to talk to an illustrator, and they said, or photographer, and he said, you sound like a nigger. Are you a nigger? And then he said, because I was looking for photo sets of African American women, nudes, and he said to me, there's no such thing as a beautiful black woman. And I don't think he said black. So I had to learn, if I was going to, since I'm here in what I call the Deep West, you develop these ways of navigating, and this has been true all of my life. From the first time I entered what would be called the white world that I grew up in. And my parents tried to prepare me for this by constantly telling me that I was the equal of anyone, that I was as good as anyone. And remember, they're telling me this is a city that they came to from the Midwest. My father was from the South, from Arkansas. My mother's from Oklahoma. They came to Southern California. They couldn't live anywhere. There was restricted housing here. My father wouldn't even tell me about his youth in Arkansas until I was an adult, because he was worried that it would cause damage, and he didn't want to transfer that damage to me. Racism is a complex dynamic. And what goes on, the messages people send you without even opening their mouths, it's in the eyes. One of my book titles is A War of Eyes, because that's essentially what racism is. It's someone looking at you and deciding that you're subhuman, they hate you, you don't get the job, you don't get the money, you don't get the house, you don't get this, you don't get what you want, your dream doesn't come true. And they don't have to say a word. It's all in the eye.
Wow.
And if you're going to enter that world, you have to develop what W.E.B. Du Bois called double vision. You have to be able to turn around and look at yourself with those eyes. That way, you can structure a defense against it. To be forewarned is to be forearmed.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One of the articles you write about your life in the 60s and your activism, and then there's one sentence that says, I decided to become an artist. That was more important to me. And maybe the sentence is a little bit out of context, but basically what I want to go is to the relationship between activism and poetry.
When I entered the political underground in the West, it was basically through my first marriage. And I was very angry, and at that time, post the riots in 1965, African Americans were vocal, openly vocal, for the first time. And part of this was inspired by Malcolm X, who visited the LA in around 1961. It wasn't highly publicized, but there was an African American underground, very active here, of African Americans who, behind the scenes, were fighting as hard as they could to have their share of the American dream. And I began to discover that and those individuals. But one of the problems is that they're all human beings. And so you get, in a movement, you get all of the distractions, all of the infighting and the squabbling and all of that. And if you can't assume, if you're not the kind of individual who's going to assume leadership, so to speak, then it's no fun. And I felt I had a lot to say. And my love of poetry and writing was so great, I decided that it wasn't going to work. To let the work be the revolution for me. Let it speak, and it speaks in broader terms, ultimately, I felt. In more human terms, in more basic and necessary terms.
Could you read one last poem for us?
Love to.
It's called The Woman in the Mirror, also from Ostinato Vamps.
Thoughts about rude limousine drivers and cabbies who do not open doors for me or turn on the music I want, and how that corresponds to the rest of the slammed doors. Corridors of them 5 decades long, wood and iron as tightly bolted, cold as the grave digger's dick. Blinking and squinting with increased frequency, particularly when working at the monitor or studying the human face. Half-seen ghosts appear on the edges of catnaps and confusions. There is a special kind of twilight that inhabits the flesh of the fatigued. Father taught me how to make fire with flint and slate, to use dried twigs or a twig and stone, a few dead leaves. He taught me the language of skunks and how to rid myself of the stench with tomato juice. Father taught me how to pitch a tent, ride a bike, hit a home run. He taught me that grief grows on the north side of the soul. The face in the mirror is the face I share with her. Contrary to what others see, I know how narrow and stupid its beauty can be, not generous at all, frightened and inappropriately girlish, brazen and unashamedly lusty. Mother taught me how to take hot plates fresh from the oven with bare hands. She used to warm them on the upper rack, explaining how rich white people do not like their food served cold. It was something I needed to know in case there were no towels handy, or if I unluckily had a hateful boss cook like she'd once had. My sister, my girlfriends, my bleedings of blood, still my gender, my skirts spotted with red after sitting on the bus or on the car seat, the skin between my thighs so delicate it is torn away by the stickum, the puffy cheeks of a medieval priestess burning her kinky hair on the altar, burning his broken eggs. Blinking and squinting with intensified work mode agendas and short-term goal lists taped to keyboards, calendars, and walls. The priorities are a generation deep, and the notion of meeting them far-fetched. Yet I harvest the mold, collect the dust and ashes, carry water from deep wells, and damn whatever bone, whatever muscle groans.
Thank you very much.